Most stories about performance cars begin with speed or noise, but the story of America's turbo era starts in a much simpler place, a parked car on a quiet street, showing its age the way real cars do when they've lived their life without attention. Nothing dramatic surrounds it, just a bit of faded paint, a slightly worn badge, and the familiar look of a machine built in a decade when expectations were changing faster than the industry could handle. If you sit inside one of these cars before sunrise, the interior has a stillness that feels very different from older American vehicles. The seats don't have the deep cracks you see in 60s muscle cars, and the dashboard doesn't carry the same sense of heritage. Instead, you notice small details that belong to a transition period. The slightly yellowed numbers on a turbo gauge, the early form of digital readouts, and buttons that were meant to look modern in a time when modern itself had a very different definition. When the key turns, the engine settles into a steady tone. There's no aggressive shake, no loud vibration, just a consistent idle from a smaller displacement engine designed to survive new rules, new fuel standards, and new expectations. A moment later, a soft whistle rises from the passenger side, the turbocharger spinning just enough to be noticed if you're listening for it. It isn't a dramatic sound. It's closer to a reminder. This car was built during a time when Detroit was trying to adapt. During the late 1970s and early 80s, manufacturers were facing real pressure. Fuel crises had reshaped driving habits. Emissions regulations had tightened. Insurance costs on high-powered engines had climbed. The familiar formula of large V8s wasn't sustainable anymore. Performance had to be reimagined, and turbocharging became the most practical path forward. It wasn't introduced as a trend. It wasn't marketed as a revolution. It was simply a solution to a problem no one could avoid. When people first experienced these cars, their reactions were mixed. Some appreciated the new direction. Others missed the old sound and feel. But the most honest impressions often came from those who didn't expect anything special. Drivers who noticed the slight hesitation before the turbo kicked in, felt the sudden rise in torque, and became quietly aware that the car was doing something different from what they had grown up with. This early turbo technology wasn't perfect, it wasn't refined, and it wasn't meant to compete with the past. It was meant to keep American performance alive during a decade that demanded smaller, cleaner, and more efficient engines. In many ways, these cars introduced a new kind of thinking long before the industry was ready for it. If you look at the parked car again, the faded paint, the slightly uneven idle, the small adjustments the engine makes on its own, you can see the story forming. The story of a decade when engineers had to work within limits they never faced before. The story of cars that tried to balance old expectations with new requirements. And the story of a brief moment when turbochargers became the bridge between what American performance had been and what it would eventually become. The interesting part isn't that these cars existed. It's that they left a quiet mark on an industry that wasn't prepared for them, and then vanished just as their potential started to grow. They were part of a shift that came early, disappeared fast, and returned decades later in a more mature form. So the question isn't whether the turbo era mattered. The real question, and the one that shapes this entire story, is much clearer. Why did America invest in turbocharged performance so seriously, only to step away from it at the moment it began to work?
The late 1970s changed American driving in ways people didn't expect. Fuel wasn't just expensive, it felt unstable. Families shortened their trips, drivers paid attention to how far a full tank would go, and slowly, the country realized the era of big engines wasn't guaranteed anymore. At the same time, emissions rules kept getting tighter. Engines had to burn cleaner, waste less, and accept restrictions that didn't exist a decade earlier. Detroit wasn't prepared for how fast things were moving. They had built a culture on cubic inches and low fuel prices. Now, both were fading. When you open the hood of a small American engine from that time, you can see the pressure the industry was under. Vacuum lines everywhere. Early emissions parts squeezed into spaces they were never designed for. It's messy, but it shows how desperate the situation had become. Engineers had to find a way to keep performance alive without ignoring the new limits. Large V8s were becoming harder to justify. Smaller engines needed help. Turbocharging appeared as the most realistic answer, not flashy, just functional. Buick was one of the first to move. Their V6 turbo project didn't start from excitement, it started from necessity. The idea was simple. If a small engine could breathe harder, it could act bigger without burning more fuel. Pontiac faced the same challenge. The Trans Am needed to survive in a world that no longer supported its old formula. A turbo version wasn't meant to replace the past, it was meant to protect the brand's future. Chrysler's situation was even more urgent. Their engines were shrinking quickly. A turbo wasn't a performance option, it was survival equipment. For all three companies, the mood inside engineering rooms was the same. Keep performance alive, even if it looks different. None of this came with confidence. Everybody knew the risks: heat, reliability, tuning, complexity. But they didn't have many choices. A mechanic once told me the early turbo engines felt like a compromise you learn to respect. He didn't mean it as criticism. He meant that these cars came from a decade where compromise was the only path forward. Sorry, we went off the topics. So let's back to the topic. So we were on the pressure shaping early turbo decisions. By the early 1980s, American drivers were changing too. They still wanted power, but they were willing to accept a smaller engine if it could deliver strength when needed. Turbocharging became that bridge, a way to give a modest engine a second wind without breaking the rules. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always smooth, but it worked well enough to convince Detroit that it deserved a chance. Europe and Japan were exploring turbos for their own reasons, but America was using them to protect something emotional, the feeling of acceleration. Without turbocharging, the performance identity of the United States would have faded more quickly, and engineers knew it. They were trying to buy time for technology to improve, time for rules to settle, time for drivers to adjust. These pressures, rising fuel costs, new regulations, public expectation, and shrinking engines created the exact conditions that allowed the turbo era to exist. Without them, this chapter never would have happened. And to understand what came next, you have to understand one thing clearly. Turbo cars in the 1980s were not experiments. They were solutions in a decade full of limits. That's why they mattered before they even arrived. And that's why what happened next hit so hard. The 1980s turbo era wasn't shaped by marketing departments. It was shaped by people who were trying to hold on to something that felt like it was slipping away. For the engineers at Buick, the challenge wasn't to build the fastest car. It was to build a car that proved American performance still had a pulse. Inside their workshop, the air often smelled like warm oil and paper. Desks cluttered with sketches, old monitors humming, half-finished calculations scattered across tables. They weren't working with cutting-edge equipment. They were working with whatever the company could afford during a difficult period. One engineer later said, "The turbo wasn't our dream, it was our chance." He didn't smile when he said it. He wasn't being poetic. He was explaining how serious things felt back then. At Pontiac, the mood was similar. The Trans Am carried a name people respected. Losing its performance identity felt like losing part of the company's history. A turbo version wasn't meant to impress purists. It was meant to protect the badge long enough for the brand to adapt. Mechanics talk about those days like a balancing act. They had to make smaller engines feel alive without breaking the fragile electronics around them. They had to work with new parts that didn't always behave consistently. One mechanic remembered his first turbo Trans Am test run. He said the car felt timid at first, almost unsure of itself. And then, with a slight delay, it pushed forward in a way he didn't expect. He described it very softly. It felt like the engine finally took a deep breath. That line stayed with me for a long time. Sorry we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic. So we were on the early impressions of turbo cars. Chrysler's engineers faced even more pressure. Their survival depended on smaller engines. A turbo wasn't a bonus, it was a lifeline. They tested engines in small rooms with uneven lighting, old gauges, and constant noise from fans running non-stop. Most of the equipment looked worn even back then. But the people working there believed the technology could carry them through the decade. Owners felt the shift too. People who bought these cars in the 80s didn't always know what to expect. Some were excited by the new technology. Others just needed a car that balanced power and fuel economy. And most drivers remember the same thing: the small delay, the quiet whistle, the sudden push. A man once told me about the first time he tried overtaking on a long road in his turbocharged Chrysler. He pressed the pedal. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the boost arrived. Gentle, not violent, but enough to make him feel the difference. He said it wasn't dramatic. It just helped me when I needed it. Sorry we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic so we were on how everyday drivers reacted. At small weekend meets, turbo cars showed up quietly. Not the stars of the row, not the loudest machines, just part of the group. People didn't gather around them the way they gathered around classic V8s, but someone always walked toward them eventually. Usually someone curious about how they worked, or someone who used to own one. There was a certain respect, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. These cars didn't define the decade. They simply held a space in it, a space where American performance tried to adjust, learn, adapt, and hold on. And that's what makes their story human. They weren't built to dominate. They were built to survive a moment when the industry didn't have clear answers. They carried the effort, the uncertainty, and the hope of the people who built them and the people who drove them.
The turning point of the turbo era didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, the way most problems do. At first, the issues were small. A little extra heat in the turbo housing, a small oil leak from a seal that wasn't designed for repeated pressure cycles. Engines were doing something new, and anything new takes time to settle. Mechanics started noticing it on regular service days. Hoods opened, engines warm. Customers saying things like, "It hesitated today," or "It made a strange sound when I climbed a hill." These weren't dramatic failures. They were the early signs of a system that needed more refinement than the decade was ready to give. Heat was the first real enemy. Turbochargers generate a lot of it, and 1980s materials weren't as durable as what came later. Metal expanded and contracted in unpredictable ways. Housings discolored. Seals wore down faster than expected. A Buick engineer once admitted, "We understood the physics, we just didn't have the time or budget for perfect solutions." That's the kind of sentence that tells you everything about the era. No bravado, just honesty. The electronics also struggled. Early NOx sensors, wiring harnesses, and control modules weren't built for constant heat and pressure. A failing sensor could confuse the system. A loose connection could change how the engine behaved from one drive to the next. Pontiac mechanics remember spending hours chasing small issues that turned out to be nothing more than a loose connector or a misread sensor. Behind the scenes, warranties started stacking up. Turbochargers needed more maintenance, more attention, and more understanding from owners who weren't used to technology that demanded patience. One owner told me he liked his Turbo Trans Am, but he didn't like the guessing. He said some days the car felt strong, and other days it felt tired. He wasn't complaining, he was describing inconsistency, something older V8s didn't struggle with in the same way. He laughed a little and said, "You just never knew which version of the car you were going to get." Sorry, we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic. So we wear on inconsistency creeping into everyday ownership. Fuel quality also played a role. Turbo engines needed cleaner fuel, stable fuel, the kind that wasn't always available everywhere in America at the time. A slightly lower quality tank could change how the engine behaved. Boost might drop, knock might increase, the car might feel unsure of itself. Dealers didn't always know how to explain it. Many were learning the technology alongside the customers. Then came the corporate pressure. GM began cutting budgets. Pontiac's leadership changed. Chrysler was fighting for survival. Companies didn't have the patience or the money to keep refining a technology that only a small percentage of buyers understood or trusted. The V8 made a quiet return in the mid to late 80s. Not the massive ones from the 60s, simpler, more reliable versions. Enough power, fewer complaints. Drivers gravitated back to them naturally, not because turbos were bad, but because V8s were familiar, predictable, steady. A mechanic summed it up perfectly. People didn't stop liking turbos, they just stopped having the energy for them. Inside GM offices, decisions sharpened. Parts cost more than expected. Warranty claims grew. Development delays piled up. Managers had to choose between continuing the experiment or returning to what already worked. They chose stability. They chose the past, not because it was better, but because the present was too complicated for the pace the industry demanded. And just like that, the turbo era, a decade of effort, learning, and adjustment, started fading before it could show its full potential. There wasn't a moment of official ending. No announcement, no ceremony. Cars just stopped being offered with turbos. Showrooms shifted focus. Marketing changed tone. Buyers moved on. The engineers who worked on those systems watched it happen slowly and quietly. Years later, many of them said they always believed the idea would return. They knew turbocharging wasn't the problem, the timing was. The 1980s gave the industry a first attempt, an imperfect attempt, but an honest one. And that turning point, the quiet collapse of something ahead of its time, became the moment that defined everything that followed.
The 1980s turbo era didn't leave behind trophies or headlines. It left behind something quieter. It left the feeling of a decade trying to change, and people trying to change with it. When you look at the engines today, sitting in small garages or resting under layers of dust, you can see the story more clearly. They weren't failures, they were first attempts. Every worn gasket, every faded turbo gauge, every loose wire shows how early the technology really was, and how brave it was to rely on it. Engineers did what they could with the tools of the time. Owners learned the behavior of cars that didn't act like anything before them. Mechanics adapted to issues no one had prepared them for. And somewhere in between, American performance found a new direction, even if it didn't work perfectly yet. A man once told me he kept his old turbo car not because it was the fastest, but because it reminded him of the moment American cars tried something different. He said the sound of the faint whistle at night made him feel like the car still had some fight left in it. Sorry we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic. So we wear on how the era stayed alive through people, not numbers. The truth is simple. The turbo era didn't disappear because it was wrong. It disappeared because it arrived before the industry was fully ready. But the lessons it taught about airflow, pressure, efficiency, response, electronics, heat, became the foundation for everything that came after. Modern engines, from small turbo 4s to boosted V8s, all follow the same logic these early cars introduced. Not in a flashy way, but in the quiet way fundamentals settle into a craft. The enthusiasts who still maintain these cars today aren't preserving them for fame or value. They preserve them because they understand what they represent. A rare moment when American performance didn't give up, it adapted. When you drive an old turbo car now, you don't feel power in a dramatic surge. You feel history in motion. A small engine trying its best with the help of a part that changed the entire future. And that's why this era matters. Not because of speed, not because of numbers, but because it showed that reinvention is possible even when the moment isn't perfect. The 1980s turbo cars carried the uncertainty of their time, the effort of their makers, and the patience of their drivers. And through all of that, they quietly shaped the decades that followed.
We end this story in a quiet place again, not with speed or sound, but with a car resting where most of these cars eventually settled. A simple garage, dust on the hood, tools that haven't moved in weeks. The engine is silent now, but the feeling behind it hasn't faded. Turbo cars from the 1980s don't try to impress anyone today. They sit calmly, almost modestly, as if they know their place in history isn't measured in trophies or record times. What they left behind was something quieter. A reminder of a decade when American performance had to learn how to breathe differently. When you look at one of these cars now, you don't immediately think about the challenges it faced or the issues that held it back. You notice the effort in its design, the intention behind its engineering, and the patience of the people who drove it. I remember someone once telling me that every time he walked past his old turbo car, he'd rest his hand on the fender for a moment. Not to admire it, not to check the paint. He just liked remembering the time in his life when the car showed him something new. Sorry, we went off the topic, so let's go back to the topic. So we wear on what these cars leave behind. The turbo era didn't survive because it was perfect. It survived in memory because it tried, honestly, imperfectly, and at the right moment. These cars carried the work of engineers who were adapting to new rules, the hope of drivers who wanted to believe in a different kind of performance, and the quiet strength of technology learning to stand on its own. And even though the era didn't last, its influence never really left. Every modern turbo engine, small or large, owes something to these early attempts. As the garage door slowly closes, the car fades back into shadow, settling into the silence it knows so well. But the story doesn't fade with it. Not yet. Not for a long time. Because some moments don't stay alive through attention. They stay alive through the people who remember them, quietly, softly, in small garages like this one. And that's where the 1980s turbo era still lives. Not on the road, but in the memory of the people it touched.